All right. Well, it's just about time. I thought TJ was going to jump on, but maybe he is tied up with all of the tech stuff he's trying to get done on this campus. There he is.
I'm here.
Hey, TJ.
Hey, think it's working great.
Can you hear him, Zach?
Yes, I can.
Is he saying
Pastor,
anything
you may want
nice?
to switch into,
He says he thinks it's working great.
but you need to switch into gallery view.
Oh, and he's saying please switch into gallery view.
I'm in gallery view.
Oh,
Okay, great.
good deal. We got the thumbs up.
All right. Thanks, TJ. Thanks for getting us set up this morning. So it's 12:01. Let's roll. This is Isolation Bible Study from Concordia in San Antonio, and I'm Bill Tucker. This is Pastor Zach McIntosh with me as well. And today we're going to dig into another psalm. No promises, but I'm thinking it may end up somewhere New Testament-ish, Jesus-ish.
Perhaps, maybe, could be.
But it's Psalm 139. If you want to open your Bible or open your Bible app and take a look, we're in Psalm 139. And so, Pastor Zach, take it away.
So this is a cool psalm. In fact, if you've been around the Bible for a while, you may have read this psalm or at least sections of the psalm. Now, there's one section of the psalm. It's so funny with these psalms. We have very famous passages in these psalms where we go, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. I've read that before. That's been a comfort to me before. And then a lot of times in these psalms, we wind up with this kind of hiccup where we go, wait, what's that? And where'd that come from? Well, Psalm 139 is a great example of this.
And as we've said the last few weeks in the message, when you come across something weird, it's probably important.
And so if you read the psalm, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go, I've heard that, I've heard that, I've heard that. And then we're going to get to a point where you're going to go, wait, that's in there? And so it's a fun psalm. Just a little note on the superscription. We've talked about how superscriptions kind of give us a little bit of a historical context. This says for the director of music of David, a psalm. And really what I want to focus on here is the part that says it's written by David. Because the fact that David wrote the psalm actually helps us interpret the psalm, because you can't understand what David says and the weird part of the psalm unless you understand that David is a man who has made some massive mistakes in his life. And so just the background of knowing who David is and knowing that David has done some pretty terrible things, including murder and adultery, which is two of the things he's very famous for, will help us understand parts of what David says in this psalm. And so Psalm 139 verse 1, David begins by saying to God, "You've searched me, Lord, and you know me." And so David begins with this kind of admission that God knows everything about him. Now, for most of us, I think we kind of intuitively understand that this is a double-edged sword, because there are things that we want other people, that we want God to know about us. So one of the things that our teachers will do here at the school, a lot of times they're room moms or like PTL, they'll put together a favorite things of the teachers list. You know, here are the places they like to go. Here's where they like to eat. You know, here are the little treats they like. And this is for, you know, parents and other folks in case they want to bring them a little something. And so there are certain things that we want other people to know, right? Maybe our favorite movie, maybe our favorite treat, maybe, you know, if Christmas is coming around, sometimes some of us will like give out Christmas lists. We want people to know certain things about us because we're kind of hoping that maybe they will take that information and use it well and wisely. But there are also things that we don't want other people to know about us. Yes, God knows David's best stuff. He knows David's highest moments. He knows his likes and his joys and his dreams, but he also knows David's worst secrets and sins. And so the big question that we're confronted with right out of the chute with this psalm, if God knows everything about David, will God still love David?
Well, one of the things that I think about on the mirror image of that is that there are always times when things happen, or we make mistakes, or we do things wrong, and we lament inside of ourselves saying, man, if you knew how hard I tried, if you knew that how much I meant that to go right or to do the right thing. And there's also a comfort in that, right? That God does know. He searches us and he knows us. And verse 2 goes to that.
Yeah, the beauty of God is not just that he knows everything about us, but what he does with that knowledge. And what God does with that knowledge is incredible. So Psalm 139 verse 2, you know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. Now here, this is another beautiful verse. I think we've all had conversations, and maybe we felt this in ourselves, where we go, God feels so distant, right? He feels like he's far away, and I call out to him and it doesn't seem like he answers. I pray to him, it doesn't seem like he cares. Now, one answer to the statement, God feels so distant, and I don't mean this to be flip at all. There's actually a beautiful comfort in this answer is, so God feels so distant. That's actually not as big of a deal as you might think it is. And here's the reason I say that. As I said, I don't say this to be flip. Notice what David says in verse 2. Oh God, you perceive my thoughts from where? From afar. Here's the beautiful thing about God. He doesn't have to be like close. He doesn't even have to feel close for him to know and understand. No matter where you are and no matter where God is, God can get to you. He sees you. He knows you. He can perceive every thought that you have.
Well, and again, just to clarify, we know that God is always there. He's always with us. That's one of his promises many, many times over in the scripture. But I like what you said, or how you fine-tuned that. Doesn't matter how we perceive it. Doesn't matter how close or far he feels to us or away from us.
So if God feels far, God's saying, well, I can perceive your thoughts from afar. Don't worry, I got you covered. Verse 3, you discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Now here's where the psalm begins to take just a little turn. This word discern, where God says of David, you discern my going out and my lying down. David knows that God discerns everything about him. The more wooden translation of the Hebrew there would be, you measure out my going out and my lying down. You measure out all my ways. In other words, God is kind of weighing everything that David does on a scales of righteousness and justice and goodness and holiness. And so here's where we begin to get kind of the very first glimpse of just a little bit of God's judgment. God is weighing out everything that David does. Now, that may be a little bit unsettling to you. I know it can be a little bit unsettling to me.
So he knows everything, and he's weighing it out, and he's judging it. And on face value, that's a big problem. It is a big problem for David, because while David did a lot of great things in his life, he did some really horrible things. And as you said earlier on, we've all got that stuff that we really don't want anybody to know. We don't want them to know those thoughts. We don't want them to know those motives or those actions or those words that we spoke. And yet God does.
And so David is kind of front loading the psalm by saying, God, listen, I know that you do have righteousness and judgment and all that stuff, and I know that applies to me. Now, that's really important that David understands that, especially as we move through the psalm and get later on into the psalm, because we're also going to see how that applies to others. But here's the key. Before it applies to anybody else, David says, God, your judgment applies to me. Verse 4, before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. And so here's kind of where David begins to really get into the character of God. So in verse 3, God is weighing out everything that David does. But then in verse 5, God hems David in behind and before, and he's laying his hand upon him. Here's the idea. God knows what David does, but he protects David anyway. God judges David's sin, but he takes care of David. He surrounds David. He's all around David anyway. Here's kind of the basic premise. Here's the glimpse that we're beginning to get into God's character. Sin doesn't scare off God. And this is the whole point and purpose of Jesus' ministry, right? Sinners didn't scare off God's Son. God can know everything. He can weigh everything, and he can still hem you in out of his love and care.
So if that's as far as we got, that would be critically important for us to remember, because we can all get discouraged. We can all feel like we're far away from God. And we automatically hear that voice of the devil who says, that's because you're so rotten. It's because God has abandoned you. It's because God can't stand you. And David says, hey, no matter what I do, God's got me hemmed in here, and his hand is on me in that loving, wonderful way, no matter how far I've drifted in my actions or attitude or words or actions.
And so in a very real sense, God has you surrounded. And that's actually a good thing, Now, here's the thing. This is so great because David is so honest here. He knows that's a good thing. David understands that, but he also understands how for some people that may feel like not such a good thing. Because we have stories in the Bible, probably most famously the story of Jonah, where what does Jonah try to do? God is hemming him in, and Jonah says, I don't want to be hemmed in by you. I want to run
He
from you.
tries desperately.
The disciples, right before Jesus goes to the cross, what do? They all flee
They
from
scatter.
him. And so we see this again and again. And so David begins to tease out this tension. So God is with him no matter what. Even though he weighs out his deeds, he still hems him in and protects him because he loves him. And yet there's something inside of him that kind of wants to run.
Now, you said something that was interesting there, Zach, because it's not only God hemming us in, because everywhere we turn, we realize that we're violating God's law, that we're not living the way he calls us to. But at the same time that we're being hemmed in, we are also being protected. And that's really powerful.
Because without God's protection, here's the thing. If we could get away from God, the only place that leads is always disaster. And so David kind of teases out this theme in verse 7 when he says, hey, God, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, and your right hand will hold me fast. Now, we need to get honest about something here. This is one of these little sections that David, in some sense, has learned the hard way. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Now, David knows the answer. He gives us the answer in verses 8, 9, and 10. There's nowhere I can go from your spirit. There's nowhere I can flee from your presence. Okay, how does David know that? Well, that goes to David's history. When he commits adultery with a woman who's not his wife, and then when he's worried that her husband's going to find out, he has him in a very underhanded and sinister way. That's the only way to describe it. He has his husband murdered, who's a soldier, who's a leader in his army, and then because he wants to cover it up. He wants to run from his responsibilities. He wants to run from his sin. He wants to run from God. But David learns that you can't run from God because God sends a prophet in Israel. His name is Nathan. And in 2 Samuel 12, you can actually go and read the story because that's part of the background for this psalm. Nathan calls out David on his sin. Now, here's the thing. It would have been so much worse if David would not have been caught. And so David knows that no matter what he does, no matter how he tries to cover it up, he can't run from God. In fact, just another little fine point on the Hebrew here. When David asks in the second part of verse 7, where can I flee from your presence? It's more woodenly, where can I flee from your face? He's always looking. And David learned it the hard way, but now with the benefit of some hindsight, he's glad he learned it.
You know, it reminds me of that whole parenting idea that we know, well, maybe yours will be, Zach, but my kids weren't perfect. And so one of the things that Julie and I prayed is that they would always get caught. Because when they get caught, there's an opportunity for correction and for redemption. If they're not, that kind of life just leads further and further away, and as you said before, leads to destruction. And so there's a comfort and a confidence that comes in knowing that God loves us too much to let us get away with our nonsense.
And so David has learned that the hard way. And isn't it great when you get a little bit of hindsight and you can go, where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go from your spirit? Man, I'm so glad I got caught. I'm so glad that I did try to run to the far side of the deep. I'm so glad that even though I did all of this crazy stuff where I tried to run away, even there, your hand was there to guide me and your right hand was there to hold me fast. Now, David kind of continues this theme in verses 11 and 12 when he says, if I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Here's the idea. If you try to cover up your sin, right? If you try to hide under the cover of darkness, the Apostle Paul will talk about this in his letters. It's shameful to mention what some people do, and then the phrase that he uses is "in the dark." If you go to the beginning of the Gospel of John, we see that Jesus, this is in John 1, right, is the light of men. Here's the idea. Anything you try to do in the dark, any way you try to cover your sin, God will find it out. This goes all the way back to the very first sin in history. When Adam and Eve sin, what do? They try to cover their sin by sewing fig leaves together and making coverings for themselves. But God sees right through all of our covers, all of our darkness. Because here's the thing. It's not just that God kind of shines. This isn't just like an interrogation, right? Shine the bright light into the darkness. What are you doing? That God says with an angry voice. It's that God pierces the darkness when we're at our worst with his light. So, Psalm 23, right? Probably the most famous psalm in the Bible. And there's that one line, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the way some translations translate that is, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I'll fear no evil. And then these words, right? For you are with me. Not just to shine a bright light and to say, I can't believe you did this, but to have your rod and your staff to comfort me. And again, that's the story of the cross, that the light comes into the darkness, not just to beat up on people who do dark things, but to comfort them and to love them.
Yeah, I love how through this whole psalm there's two sides of the same coin, right? There's that side of our sin and our brokenness and our shame, and there's that side of our fear and our anxiety in God's presence. And the reality is that light is awfully welcome when we're scared, just like that light is not so welcome when we're trying to hide.
There is a reason, right, that kids love night lights. And there is something to be said. When you're stuck in darkness, just a little bit of light can go a long way. And that's Jesus. That's Jesus. Now, David has been talking about how God is with him, how he can't hide from him. Now, David's going to talk about himself a little bit in verses 13 and 14 when he says, "For you, O God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and I'm wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well." And so here's what David's doing. He's actually celebrating himself, but not just himself in the sense that he thinks he's awesome. Yeah, he's celebrating himself in the sense that he's been created wonderfully by God. And I love that last phrase where David says, I know this. I know this full well. Now, this is just one of these real practical lines, because one of the things that I would ask folks who are watching is, do you know that full well? Do you believe that full well? Because this goes in a couple of different ways, right? It goes in like how you treat your body, because if you're fearfully and wonderfully made, right? How you eat matters. We're going to be talking about this in a couple of weeks. How you exercise matters, right? The things you actually do with your body, all of that matters because you're fearfully and wonderfully made. But it also matters when it comes to basic views that you have of yourself. You might call this self-esteem. Do you look in the mirror and go, ugh? Well, then you need these verses. You need to remember that even if you don't always love you, God loves you because he made you. And so this goes to how you treat yourself physically and how you perceive yourself emotionally.
I think about, again, makes me think about from a parenting standpoint, how often maybe your kids struggle with certain things and they don't see the end, and they become discouraged, and maybe they become discouraged with themselves. And yet from a little different perspective, you can speak into their lives because you see their potential, you see their beauty, you see the wonder in how God has made them. And that's what David is realizing here, that despite all of his faults and flaws, all of the ways that he has stumbled, all the times that God has revealed the sin in his life, God has also revealed to him that he's blessed him and he has created him in an amazing way.
And so here's how much God cares about David, right? Here's how much God cares about how he's created David. This isn't just like, adult David, grown up David, David who's king, David who's accomplished a lot. And so now God looks at David and goes, man, you're a good warrior. You've won a lot of, battles. I've done a good job creating you. You're strong. You're powerful. Yeah, you've made some mistakes, but hey, you've done a lot right. No, no, no. This has nothing actually to do with what David has accomplished. This goes way back. Psalm 139, verse 15, just so that David doesn't get the sense that the reason that God cares about David is because what he's done. David says, my frame was not hidden for you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. And that's an old Hebrew euphemism for like the mother's womb. And so the idea is this. Um, even before sonograms, God had a sonogram of David. And he was looking and he was going, wow, I'm so excited about this creation of mine. Verse 16, David keeps going, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Now, this is tough, but it's really important. God sees David even when he doesn't have a body, but his unformed body. Now, here's the thing. We live in a society that really does weird things with forms. We'll talk about people who are like deformed. Well, if God sees people who are unformed, what does that say about, people who we would call deformed? Or we'll talk about people who are misinformed, right? People who maybe don't agree with us politically or maybe have a different cultural background than us. And we'll talk about how they're misinformed or malinformed. Well, if God sees them unformed, what does that mean for all the people who are formed a little differently than us? How should we treat them? Because here's the thing, no matter what form we're in, no matter what shape we're in, okay, no matter what we may look like on the outside, no matter how beautiful or how not so beautiful we may be, if God sees our unformed body, it means that he has a plan and a purpose for our formed body, which means that has big implications on how we treat others.
Yeah, and obviously, that's a word, Zach, that cannot be overspoken when it comes to this particular time where we're struggling to wrap our arms around injustice and racism and all of those kinds of things. That the message of Christianity isn't about choosing one over another, and literally, the message of Christians must be love for everyone.
And so, if you see someone and you think, man, they are way out of line, they are so different from me. Remember, before you just look at their form and judge them, okay, by even some crazy things that they say, and they may say some crazy things. Remember, before they had lips to speak those crazy things or minds to think those things, before they had any form at all, God saw them unformed. And he loved them anyway.
It makes me think of Ephesians 1, where it says, before the foundation of the world was laid. So there was no formation of our bodies at that point whatsoever. Before the foundation of the world was laid, God chose us to be adopted as his children.
And if that's what he wants, then that's how we should treat others. It really is that simple. And we need that reminder constantly, especially in this day and age. So verses 17 and 18, David continues, how precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. And when I awake, I'm still with you. So there are a couple of different things that are going on here. Number one, David's just kind of giving us a classic exposition of what we might call the omniscience of God, that God knows everything, okay? There's like a vast sum. God knows so much that it outnumbers the grains of sand. And then I love what he just drops in at the end. But when I awake, I'm still with you. And so here's the idea. God knows everything. He could be paying attention to lots of things. He could be devoted to lots of things. But God is devoted to David. He's big, and yet he's personal. He's transcendent, and yet he's very, very intimate. It's an amazing feat that God can pull off. Pretty straightforward so far.
Straightforward, and we've got a little ways to go. So keep
Yep.
going, brother.
So verse 19, here we go. So we got David, being formed by God and God always being with David and David learning that he can't run from God and God
He
loves
knows how
him.
bad we are. He's still
Yep.
there with us.
All that good stuff.
Whoops.
Verse 19, if only you, God, would slay the wicked. Now, where did this come from? This is probably part of Psalm 139 that you don't remember. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them as my enemies. Now, here's the thing. David has people that he's not in good with right now. And he's very honest about those people. In fact, he gives voice to what's going on inside of him. Now, this is something we need to remember, critically important. Just because someone gives voice honestly before God to what's going on inside of them, okay, feelings that they feel and quite frankly, feelings that you might feel, doesn't necessarily mean those feelings are just carte blanche, holy or right. And so here's what's so interesting. Right after David says, hey, God, I got these wicked people, man, just like you've dealt with me, I want you to deal with them. They are bloodthirsty. They speak against you. They're in rebellion against you. They're enemies of me. This is a mess. Notice, right after he gives voice to all of that, what does he do? He snaps back right to himself. And he actually ends as he begins. In verses 23 and 24, he says, God, search me and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, remember how the psalm begins. Psalm 139, verse 1, you've searched me and you know me. God searches and knows. How does the psalm end? Verse 23, God, search me and know me. Now, here's the key, and here's the reason we need to make sure we get this psalm right. David begins with an invitation to God. Search me, know me. I know I have problems in my life, and they're huge problems. And so work with me on those problems. Then, for a few verses 19 through 22, he says, guess what? There are other people, God, who have problems in their life too. And you know what? I need your righteousness in this situation. I need your judgment because this can't stand. This is wrong. This makes me angry. And then as soon as he says that, he goes, now back to me and what I need from you, because I have stuff that's wrong too. And so David begins with his own sin, his own struggle. He moves to other people in their sin and in their struggle, and then he moves right back to his own sin and his own struggle. So Jesus has this real famous little section in the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about other people who sin. And what does he say? He says, well, listen, it's not that you shouldn't remove a plank from somebody else's eye. It's not that you shouldn't call somebody out when they're doing something wrong. That's not bad, but deal with you first. Here's what Psalm 139 is. It's that working out in real time and in real life. Yes, David has wicked people around him, and David is not afraid to call them out, and David is not afraid to ask for God's help, and David is not afraid to ask for God's judgment, but he starts with himself.
Well, and as I read these words, it occurs to me that he gets off on a tangent. He thinks about those folks that are bad to him, those bloodthirsty folks that are his enemies, and he kind of goes off on a little rant, and all of a sudden he goes, oh, wait a minute. Let's bring this back. Let's get real. God, search me and know my heart, know my thoughts. He scales it back because the emotions that he expresses in verses 19 to 22, they're real. That's exactly how he feels. But so is the whole rest of the psalm, where he's making this confession and praising God for this amazing ability to know him and love him in spite of his faults and his flaws. And I think it's a beautiful sort of an illustration of how we live constantly and every day before God, trying to be humble, trying to be righteous, failing at almost every turn, uh, going off on rants, and then realizing, you know what, this needs to start with me. This whole change needs to begin in my heart.
So, one of the things that I love about the gospel, there are many things that I love about the gospel, is that what David does in this psalm is exactly what God does with himself. Because when it comes to judgment, when it comes to wrath, it falls on God's Son first. In other words, God judges Jesus and then he judges us. He judges Jesus and then he examines us in light of what's already happened to Jesus. And that's what makes all the difference. Jesus doesn't just say, start with yourself before you move to others. He models that in the very core of his ministry, because God's cross is the reality that before God judges us, he judges Jesus, and we are judged in the light of God's judgment of Jesus. What would happen if before you judged other people, right? If before you said, I got real enemies and there are real problems out there that really need to be dealt with, you started with yourself and you said, well, I have real problems in me. And you know what? If I'm wanting God's grace for me, what do I want for others?
Another great study, Zach. Awesome. So we're at the end of our time, but I appreciate you joining us. This is Isolation Bible Study from Concordia. By the way, don't forget to register for worship in person. Of course, online worship will go on as it always does, but we're worshiping in person. It's been wonderful to see more and more people back on campus. It's safe. It's disinfected. We've got amazing ventilation. It's a good place to be, and you're going to be blessed. Just last week, I was sitting in the worship service, and it almost brought me to tears to hear again the voices of our people echoing when they were singing or when they were saying the Lord's Prayer. And so if you're looking for that, I'll tell you where you can find it, at Concordia. Go to our webpage, register to join us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday. We'll also look forward to seeing you again on Friday. I think we'll have a teaching from Pastor Teskey on Friday about how to hear from God in light of the message from this past weekend. So God bless you folks. I know we're over time. Thanks for being with us. Have a great day.